Hello, welcome to Maps of Math. Today I'm going to do a video on what are natural transformations. So this is part of a little intro category theory series. Going to get used all over the place. I'm probably not going to dwell or make too many category theory videos just yet, but it's useful for understanding a lot of things I do want to show. I want to be doing some videos on tensors, some things on the exterior algebra, the Clifford or geometric algebras, as well as some other stuff, and it's just helpful to have some basics of category theory in play while we do it. This video, we'll just do a quick run through of, so I did a video on what are categories, what are functors, and then the third part of that triumvirate is then what are, or third step in that hierarchy are what are natural transformations. From here, we're going to go into, probably going to do free and forgetful functors as a good example, maybe adjoint functors, and then we're going to start probably getting more into some of those videos I was just describing, showing how to build tensors, how to build the exterior algebra, the geometric algebra, and so on. All right, so today's video, what are natural transformations? So just remember our setting. We've got a category. A category is this collection of mathematical objects of one type, and there's some sort of relationships between them. They're directed relationships. We can put the relationships together. So if x is related to y is related to z, then x is going to be related to z. You can compose stuff. Those putting together of things is associative. We've got identity relationships. Okay, this ends up being a fabulous framework for most of math. Not all, and frankly, the parts of math that aren't as suitable, it's just actually because they're more complex. And so actually, I'm not so convinced just yet that as someone whose background is in, say, analysis and some of the areas of math that are much less categorical, I actually just think they need more sophisticated versions of this, or you got to step up. This stuff is too simple for it. But anyway, let's not get off topic too much. So, okay, in our category, we've got objects. We've got arrows, which are these directed relationships between the objects, and those we're going to satisfy composition. We can stick arrows together. Associativity, if we stick 3 arrows together, it doesn't matter if we put the first 2 together, then the third, or the second and the third with the first. It needs to yield the same thing. We need to have identity relationships. The category theory model I've cited in the other videos that we should always ask are, what are the maps? What are the morphisms? What are the arrows? So anytime you meet a mathematical object, you say, hey, this object, probably what matters are the way it relates to other things. What are the right sorts of relationships? And so then if you apply that immediately to, say, categories, well, then you get functors. So functors are the right notion of arrows between categories. Now, I use the term right. What determines what the right type of relationship is, usually it's force, and there really is only one. I'm not actually too sure how many times there are multiple, but it's things like you've got a topological space. Well, you care about preserving the topology, and it ends up being that continuous maps are the ones. Or you've got a vector space, and they have a vector structure, a linear structure, and so you care about linear maps that respect that linear structure, and so on. Anyway, functors end up being our way to relate things between categories. So if you've got this functor f between categories a and b, let's remember what goes into the functor. Like what does that arrow f consist? So first off, for objects x that are in category a, well, you get maps that give us objects in b. Okay, so you map all objects in a into objects in b. But the point is, hey, in categories, we care about objects, but really we care about objects with their relationships. The relationships are what give us the useful information and define the object. So we don't just want to transport a single object. We want to transport this sort of, I'm going to use the word dimensional, but not in a precise way, this sort of higher dimensional type of information where there's not just an object, but there's 2 objects and a relationship between them. And the functor is going to map that whole thing over. And then if you look here, all you do is you put f's in front of everything, but it's saying, there's you need to, whatever x and y go to, we got to make sure that the relationship little f gets mapped by the functor big F to preserve, it's still gonna go between whatever f of x and f of y are. And then similarly, we want to preserve the category structure, so we end up preserving identities. So if we map an identity, the identity on x, well, then we want that to be 1 on whatever f mapped x to, okay? And then similarly for composition, it needs to be, hey, this is, and this ends up being the thing that preserves the composition law, which we want to have. Okay, see those videos if you want more. Okay, so we got categories, we got functors. You can keep going. You say, hey, let's apply that motto. Well, that would then say, what are the right types of functors are a type of mathematical object? What are the right sort of morphisms or maps or arrows between functors? Well, those would be natural transformations. So, we're after what are the right maps between functors. So first, we got to specify what the setting is where that makes sense. So to start with, you need two functors that have the same domain and codomain. So F and G both start at A, category A, and they both end at category B. Okay? And so then what we're going to want, you can do either direction, but we'll do an arrow from F to G. So then the question is, what is an arrow? Of what should an arrow from F to G consist? So we just said for functors, you end up having a collection of maps for every object in A, and then you also have a set of maps for every arrow, and they have to respect the arrow codomains and domains. They have to preserve identity, they have to preserve composition. So the question is, well, what's the right notion for natural transformations? What do they need to have in them? All right, so first off, just how you write this. Generally, you write it so you've got F here, G here. Usually we actually use this other arrow, which is more like the implies arrow. So alpha is our natural transformation going between F and G. And you see how we've gone up a level. So like notice there's nested hierarchies of relationships. A and B are each themselves collections, small or big, who knows, of objects with relationships. F and G are maps are two potentially different maps of all the relationships and objects in A into B. And so you've already got, you're mapping this world of relationships, and then alpha is mapping those mappings. So notice how we're going up. And this actually, you can get into things like higher category theory, and natural transformations we're starting to move into two categories implicitly without really bringing it up, but I'm not going to go there. So the rest of this video, our question is simply, what should alpha have in it? All right, so let's take an object X in our category A. Well, both our functors, F and G, they're going to map X to two objects in B. They may be different, they may be the same, it doesn't actually matter, but you end up with F of X and F of G, two objects in category B. So if we look, we're trying to figure out, like, this is a big generic name for, or this isn't pulling apart the pieces, right? This is there's a packaging of stuff that makes up alpha, and we're trying to actually get into that and say, well, what is inside of that? So at a minimum, we should have, for each object X in the category A, we're going to want maps alpha sub X that map F of X to G of X. Okay, so these are called component mappings, and they're components because we think about them being one for every object in A. So for every object, so it's like this, and this can all get swapped in and out with different objects in A. And every object in A, you can swap in, and you get an alpha sub that object, and you get a map from F of that object to G on that object. Okay, so notice, here this is X in A, but then this is a map in B. So we end up with this big collection of maps in B that move between the targets of the two functors. Okay, we're almost done. Actually, the natural transformations in one way are simple. So now, have in your head, we're in category B, we've got this big old collection of maps. Well, it could be small. It depends on how many objects and things. But for all the objects in A, we've got these maps in B between the two different functor targets that operate on the object. All right, so now what? So we're still trying to figure out what alpha consists of. We know it at least has these component mappings. So then, well, that was just for objects in A. Remember, the more interesting thing aren't objects in isolation, they're objects with their relationships. So now, let's look at an entire arrow in A. So you've got an arrow, F, a relationship, a map, a morphism from X to Y. Okay, I put a little note. This is some morphism in A. Well, what should happen? Well, we know, let's examine what f and g do to that arrow. Let's remember. So f is going to map this whole thing coherently. So is g. So if we look on this top here in green, we've got f of x, f of y, and the arrow f of on little f. So this is just this whole relationship is now mapped into b in some way by functor f. And similarly, this whole relationship is mapped into b by g. Well, we just said, though, if I now ignore horizontal and just look vertical for a second, let's just put your eyes over here. Well, here we've got x and x, f on x, g on x. This is exactly what I just said there should be a component mapping between. So there's an arrow. We've just said natural transformation should have an arrow between f of x and g of x. That's alpha sub x. That's the component mapping. Same thing over here. Here's f of y, g of y. There should be a component mapping, alpha of y. So it seems entirely, and I'll use the word natural because it is natural, it seems entirely natural to say, hey, we want diagrams like this to commute. Because the point is, this is the functor structure on the horizontal, and we've already said the natural transformation at a minimum needs to have this vertical arrows. It should be the case that whether I map by the functor, then apply the component of the natural transformation, or I map by the component of the natural transformation and then apply the functor, that diagram should commute. Note, this whole diagram is in B, right? Because f of x, f of y, this whole thing's in B, the components are in B, so this is a coherence condition inside of category B. So we can now summarize this. In one way, natural transformations feel complex, but they actually, if you look at them right, there's only a little bit to them. So a natural transformation alpha, of what should it consist? So we end up with a collection of maps in B, where for every object x, x is an object in A, we end up with this component mapping. So we got this whole, well, however, it depends on how big A is, but it could be big or small. But for every object in A, we've got a component mapping alpha sub that object. And there's just actually only one condition, such that diagrams like this commute, where again, this is the f applied to the relationship, this is g applied to the relationship, little f, and then if we apply the components, this diagram commutes. Let's do a quick example just to show these things. I'm going to, well, at some point I'll do more examples. I don't know. I'm probably going to go more functors here. I don't know early if I'll hit natural transformations a ton, but they do matter and they are going to show up a ton. But let's just do a pretty straightforward one. Let's look at the category vect k. So this consists of vector spaces where k is the field. Okay, the arrows between them are linear maps between those vector spaces. Let's look at two functors. So I'm going to call id the identity functor. So, I should say these are going to be functors from vect k to vect k. So it's got the same target and the same domain and codomain. And then let's look at the double dual functor. So that takes, actually here, that's going to take each vector space to its double dual, and it similarly maps correctly there by evaluation. I think I call out what these are. So here's vect k, here's vect k, here's our identity functor, here's our double dual functor, and let's talk about the natural transformation eta that's between them. So, all right, let's break down what. So if we've got the identity functor on a, this is V now, one of these vector spaces inside vect k. The identity functor on it is just going to be V, okay? And then the double dual as well, the double dual. So let's look at, so this is now eta sub V. This is one of these component maps. And let's look at what it actually does for a second. So it maps any given particular x inside of here, any vector, to eval x. And how does that work, just to make it clear? Well, go up just a little bit. If phi, or phi, depending on which way you like to say it, but if phi is something in the dual space, so it's in V star, eval x on phi, well, all you're going to do is just, x is a vector. Phi is something in the dual space. So if I want to get something in the double dual, I simply take phi and apply x, right? So phi is in the dual, x is in the vector space, and that ends up with a k. You can check that eta ends up being a natural transformation. The point is not to do a proper check here, but just to give an example of a natural transformation that matters. I'll note that there's not a natural transformation between the identity and the dual functor. That's actually a really important fact. So the double dual has a natural transformation with the identity. The dual does not. There end up being isomorphisms from at least finite dimensional vector spaces in the dual, but they're not natural. That ends up being actually a pretty important point. That's why you have to do things like pick metrics, quadratic forms, to then specify one when you want to like raise and lower indices and do things like a Hodge star or something like that. Okay, so that's just an example. Great one to work out if you want to like make sure that it's actually a natural transformation. And actually pretty good examples just to work out if you're not too used to functors. Double check that the identity functor and the double dual are in fact functors. Check all those conditions. That would be an excellent homework assignment. Okay, so next video, at least in this little short series, I'm going to do free and forgetful functors. That's actually what I've been mostly working up towards, because I want to, again, I want to show where tensors come from, where the exterior algebra comes from, where the Clifford and geometric algebras come from. And to do those, it's the same pattern where you take some underlying space, you usually apply a free functor, and then after you apply the free functor, you have to apply some quotienting construction, because it ends up free functors are going to make things too big, and so then you have to, like, you start in your space, it's not as big as you want, you make it bigger, but it's too big, and it doesn't respect certain structure you need, so then you apply a quotient construction, which then sort of mods out, it does mod out by the things you want to be equivalent, and that ends up being whether it's your space of tensors, or your exterior algebra, or your Clifford algebra. So that's coming. I'll probably also make a video on adjoint functors, because free and forgetful functors are the great classic example of free and forgetful functors. By no means the only one, but they're certainly the simplest, and they're a strongly motivated one. And actually, it can be really important to start to get a sense of the difference between right and left adjoints, because they tend to be different. One tends to be something that sort of conserves structure and respects them, which is going to be like the forgetful functors, and the other one's going to be generative and sort of make new stuff, and that's going to be what the free functors are going to be like. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. More videos coming when my life allows it.